of the church who is engaging in this activity, right, of burning heretics at the stake, and Jesus Christ, who will never speak throughout the entire dialogue. In other words, it's one of those compelling things where, you know when we studied Glaspel's Trifles, and we said that Miss Wright is the key actress in the play, but never actually is there on stage or speaks? We have something very similar happening here with Jesus Christ. The Grand Inquisitor is actually a monologue. It's not a dialogue, really. It's a monologue. And yet it works as a dialogue because Jesus Christ is sitting there the whole time. And we already know what Christ has said through our study of the Gospels, and of course our reading of Matthew 4 particularly. And yet he will never speak. The Grand Inquisitor. Is it thou? Thou. But receiving no answer, he adds at once, don't answer. Be silent. What canst thou say indeed? I know too well what thou wouldst say, and thou hast no right to add anything to what thou hast said of old. Why then art thou come to hinder us? Now notice that the Grand Inquisitor will almost always speak in the collective pronoun of us. He'll rarely talk about I. It's always us, because obviously he represents the church. For thou hast come to hinder us, and thou knowest that. But dost thou know what will be tomorrow? I know not who thou art, and care not to know whether it is thou or only a semblance of him. But tomorrow I shall condemn thee and burn thee at the stake as the worst of heretics. Now, the irony is just abound. Jesus Christ comes back. It's during the time of the Inquisition, and the Grand Inquisitor is going to once again kill Jesus Christ. Only instead of on a cross, now we're going to burn him. Okay? And the very people who have today kissed thy feet, tomorrow, at the faintest sign from me, will rush to heap up the embers of thy fire. You know, in other words, the very people who just showed you such great loyalty will tomorrow, at my recommendation, burn you. Now, this is, of course, one of our first key moments of the critique of the mass, the people, right? He says, knowest thou that? And again, notice we keep coming back to the word know, the epistemological question. What do you know, right? And of course he says, I know who you are. Then he says, I'm not sure who you are, but I'm hoping that you at least know this. And if you're Jesus Christ, then obviously you know the future, and therefore you know this already. Knowest thou that? Yes, maybe thou knowest it, he added, with thoughtful penetration. Notice the word maybe, which suggests that fallibilist principle as we've talked about it epistemologically. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, right? He added with thoughtful penetration, never for a moment taking his eyes off the prisoner. Notice Jesus Christ now is referenced as the prisoner. And we can't help but think of Plato's cave allegory, right? Book 7 of Republic. And then we have the interruption. Alyosha. He's like, wait. This is like, what kind of story are you telling me? We think of Glaucon's interrupting, of course, Socrates in his presenting of the cave allegory as well. He says, I don't quite understand, Ivan. What does it mean? Alyosha, who had been listening in silence, said with a smile, is it simply a wild fantasy or a mistake on the part of the old man, some impossible quid pro quo? And then Ivan, take it as the last, said Ivan, laughing, if you're so corrupted by modern realism and can't stand anything fantastic. Now, this is fascinating, the way that Ivan will bring into this discussion the modern question of science and what can you know epistemologically? What are you willing to believe, in other words? If you like it to be the case of mistaken identity, let it be so. It's true, he went on, laughing. The old man was 90. He might well be crazy over his set idea. He may have been struck by the appearance of the prisoner. It might, in fact, be simply his ravings, the delusion of an old man of 90, overexcited by the auto de fe of 100 heretics the day before. But does it matter to us, after all, whether it was a mistake of identity or a wild fantasy? All that matters is that the old man should speak out, that he should speak openly of what he has thought in silence for 90 years. In other words, Ivan says, the only thing I'm interested in is what this Grand Inquisitor has been believing for a very long time. And now Alyosha, and the prisoner too is silent? Does he look at him and not say a word? Now, of course, this silence of Christ is in the tradition of the Gospels, where it's purported that Jesus Christ, when he was preparing to be killed, rarely spoke, as opposed to, of course, as any number of scholars have pointed out, as opposed to Socrates, who, of course, in Plato's Apology, make an entire defense for his life before he finally goes and dies. And, of course, even then, he has a lot of talking We've given lectures, of course, on apology, credo, and the Phaedo as well, right? That's enviable, Ivan says. And he says, that's inevitable in any case. Ivan laughed again. The old man is told, Christ him, he hasn't the right to add anything to what he has said of old. One may say it's the most fundamental feature of Roman Catholicism, in my opinion at least. Now, again, Ivan is a great atheist, a great skeptic of the church. All has been given by thee to the Pope, they say, and all henceforth is still in the Pope's hands, and there's no need for thee to come now at all. Thou must not meddle for the time at least. That's how they speak and write too, the Jesuits at any rate. I've read it myself in the works of their theologians. Hast thou the right to reveal to us one of the mysteries of the world from which thou hast come? My old man asks him, and answers the question for him. No, thou hast not. That thou mayest not add to what has been said of old, and mayest not take from men the freedom which thou didst exalt when thou wast on earth. Now, this will be the first use of the word freedom, and it's our important marker, because that's what we're going to be focusing on, this notion of freedom. Of course, in the cave allegory, our emancipated young person from the cave is, of course, free, right? Through education of fear and pain and all of that, as we've said in other lectures. Whatsoever thou revealest anew will encroach on men's freedom of faith. He's imagining now that this is what the Grand Inquisitor would say to Christ. For it will be manifest as a miracle, and the freedom of their faith was dearer to thee than anything in those days 1,500 years ago. Didst thou not often say then, now here again, the Grand Inquisitor speaking again to Christ, didst thou not often say then, I will make you free? But now thou hast seen these free men. The old man adds suddenly with a pensive smile. Yes, we've paid dearly for it. He goes on looking serenely at him, but at last we've completed that work in thy name. For 15 centuries we've been wrestling with thy freedom, but now it's ended and over for good. Dost thou not believe that it's over for good? Thou lookest meekly at me, and deignest not even to be wroth with me. But let me tell thee now, today, people are more persuaded than ever that they have perfect freedom, yet they have brought their freedom to us and laid it humbly at our feet. But that has been our doing. Was this what thou didst? Was this thy freedom? And so he imagines this will be the question for Christ. In other words, what kind of freedom did you actually bring to people in your message? Now, this will be more than poor Alyosha can stand, and so he will interrupt again. I don't understand again, Alyosha broke in. Is he ironical? Is he jesting? Not a bit of it, Ivan will respond. He claims it as a merit for himself and his church that at last they have vanquished freedom and have done so to make men happy. Now, Dostoevsky, I mean, I really do. I agree with Jordan Peterson. I think that he's one of the greatest writers of all time, and I think this passage speaks directly to challenges about what it means when Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their created with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice our dates of when this is published, and notice the 1776 date of the Declaration of Independence. We've given full lectures on the DOI elsewhere at learnstrong.net, but notice the first use of the word happy, of course, our notion in AP 303 of Scooby snacks, right? For now, he is speaking of the Grand Inquisitor, of the Inquisition, of course. For now, for the first time, it has become possible to think of the happiness of men. Man was created a rebel, and how can rebels be happy? Thou wast warned, he says to him. Thou hast had no lack of admonitions and warnings, but thou didst not listen to those warnings. Thou didst reject the only way by which men might be happy. But fortunately, departing, thou didst hand on the work to us. Thou hast promised, thou hast established by thy word. Thou hast given to us the right to bind and to unbind. And now, of course, thou canst not think of taking it away. Why then hast thou come to hinder us? In other words, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, the famous Matthew 16 passage, that is to say, the very idea upon which the Roman Catholic Church will be founded, and of course, the very idea that Protestants will then contest after Luther. He says, we were given the power upon your departure, and we have used it. Why are you here to stop us, to hinder us. And Alyosha's not done. And what's the meaning of no lack of admonitions and warnings, asked Alyosha. And then Ivan, why, that's the chief part of what the old man must say. And now we're ready to go to work with the Matthew 4 passage we started our discussion with. He will not call the devil. Rather, the Inquisitor will call him the wise and dread spirit. The wise and dread spirit, the spirit of self-destruction and non-existence. Non-existence makes us immediately think of course, Goethe's Faust, and we've given lectures as well on Mephistopheles, and Goethe's obviously going to play around with very similar kinds of ideas. The great spirit talked with thee in the wilderness, and we are told in the books that he tempted thee. The word tempted, by the way, has quotation marks around it. Is that so? And could anything truer be said than what he revealed to thee in 3 questions, and what thou didst reject? And one of the books is called The Temptation. And yet, if there has ever been on earth a real stupendous miracle, it took place on that day, on the day of the 3 temptations. The statement of those 3 questions was itself the miracle. If it were possible to imagine, simply for the sake of argument, that those 3 questions of the dread spirit had perished utterly from the books, and that we had to restore them and to invent them anew, and to do so had gathered together all the wise men of the earth, rulers, chief priests, learned men, philosophers, poets, and had set them the task to invent 3 questions such as would not only fit the occasion, but express in 3 words, 3 human phrases, the whole future history of the world and of humanity. We think, of course, of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? The famous question, right? Dost thou believe that all the wisdom of the earth united could have invented anything in depth and force equal to the 3 questions which were actually put to thee then by the wise, and notice he doesn't call him dread now spirit, he calls him mighty spirit in the wilderness. From those questions alone, from the miracle of their statement, we can see that we have here to do not with the fleeting human intelligence, but with the absolute and eternal. For in those 3 questions, the whole subsequent history of mankind is, as it were, brought together into one whole and foretold, and in them are united all the unsolved historical contradictions of human nature. So notice what Dostoevsky is able to pull off here with the Grand Inquisitor already speaking. He will reduce the 3 questions of the devil, as is referred to in Matthew 4. Here it's the mighty spirit. He can reduce all of humankind's history down to those 3 questions. That alone makes this a fascinating passage for us to read, right? At the time, it could not be so clear, since the future was unknown. But now that 1,500 years have passed, we see that everything in those 3 questions was so justly divined and foretold, and has been so truly fulfilled that nothing can be added to them or taken from them. Notice this idea of nothing added to or taken from. That is to say, we've got all the text we need to be able to do the things we need to do. And now to the very first of the Matthew 4 questions by the devil to Christ. Judge thyself who was right, thou or he who questioned thee then. Remember the first question, its meaning? In other words, was this: thou wouldst go into the world and art going with empty hands, with some promise of freedom, which men, in their simplicity and their natural unruliness, cannot even understand, which they fear and dread. Now this use of the word dread, I mean, we've already heard the wise and dread spirit. So now notice the use of that word a second time, only in a powerful reversal. In other words, the one thing that all humans fear the most is the concept of freedom. For nothing has ever been more insupportable for a man in a human society than freedom. Now, we'll find ourselves, obviously, as our study with Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto will join to a study like this. And the idea of Marxian utopias will immediately come to mind. He will say the one thing humans fear the most is in fact freedom. And this is why we will call this a critique of escape from freedom. Not Thoreau's an escape to freedom, but escape from freedom, right? He'll say it this way. But seest thou these stones in this parched and barren wilderness? Turn them into bread, and mankind will run after thee like a flock of sheep, grateful and obedient, though forever trembling, lest thou withdraw thy hand and deny them thy bread. But thou wouldst not deprive men of freedom, and didst reject the offer, thinking, What is that freedom worth if obedience is bought with bread? Thou didst reply that man lives not by bread alone. But dost thou know that for the sake of that earthly bread, the spirit of the earth will rise up against thee, and will strive with thee, and overcome thee, and all will follow him, crying, Who can compare with this beast? He has given us fire from heaven. We think immediately of Prometheus. So Dostoevsky's bringing together both, obviously, Athens as well as Jerusalem. Back to the Tertullian question, right? What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? Dost thou know that the ages will pass, and humanity will proclaim by the lips of their sages that there is no crime, and therefore no sin. There is only hunger, freed men, and then ask of them virtue. That's what they'll write on the banner which they will raise against thee, and with which they will destroy thy temple. Where thy temple stood will raise a new building. The terrible Tower of Babel will be built again. And though, like the one of old, it will not be finished, yet thou mightest have prevented that new tower, and have cut short the sufferings of men for 1,000 years. For they will come back to us after 1,000 years of agony with their tower. They will seek us again, hidden underground in the catacombs. And the fact of underground makes us immediately think of Dostoevsky's notes from the underground, but as well, of course, this underground reference to Plato's cave. Hidden underground in the catacombs, for we shall be again persecuted and tortured. They will find us and cry to us, Freed us, for those who have promised us fire from heaven haven't given it. And then we shall finish building their tower. For he finishes the building who feeds them, and we alone shall feed them in thy name, declaring falsely that it is in thy name. Oh, never, never can they feed themselves without us! Exclamation point. No science will give them bread so long as they remain free. And again, this tension between science and religion, obviously Dostoevsky's very much playing with. In the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, Make us your slaves, but feed us. They will understand themselves at last that freedom and bread are enough, for all are inconceivable together. For never, never will they be able to share between them. In other words, here's the choice. Either you have your freedom or you have something to eat. You can't have both. They will be convinced, too, that they can never be free, for they are weak, vicious, worthless, and rebellious. In other words, the question of human nature. Sounding, of course, very, very much like this idea of Hobbes in Leviathan, right? Thou, he says, dost promise them the bread of heaven. But I repeat again, can he compare with earthly bread in the eyes of the weak, ever sinful, and ignoble race of man? And if for the sake of the bread of heaven, thousands shall follow thee, what is to become of the millions and tens of thousands of millions of creatures who will not have the strength to forego the earthly bread for the sake of the heavenly? Or dost thou care only for the tens of thousands of the great and strong, while the millions, numerous as the sands of the sea, who are weak but love thee, must exist only for the sake of the great and the strong? No, now we're going to get the Grand Inquisitor and maybe his most sardonic. No, we care for the weak too. They're sinful and rebellious, but in the end, they too will become obedient. They will marvel at us and look on us as gods, because we are ready to endure the freedom which they have found so dreadful, and to rule over them. So awful it will seem to them to be free. Now again, here we are now at Plato's tyrannical man, no question about it. We will take the burden of freedom and we will turn them all into slaves, and they will do exactly what we say through violence of any number of types, right? But we shall tell them that they are the servant, but we shall tell them that we are thy servants and rule them in thy name. We shall deceive them again, for we will not let thee come to us again. Now this is irony, of course, because here he is. He's back, right? That deception will be our suffering, for we shall be forced to lie. Now this, of course, takes us back to Republic and, of course, the famous Phoenician myth of the metals of Plato, right? So we're playing a very similar kind of game. In other words, to get the ideal Republic, we're going to have to lie, even though theoretically it's for the better, it's for the greater good. This is that tension, right, that politically has always been there. To what degree do we want our politicians to be truthful to us versus liars to us so that we can get the things we want, namely to get bread, to be fed, right? It becomes the symbol of all symbols. He says it this way. This is the significance of the first question in the wilderness, and this is what thou hast rejected for the sake of that freedom which thou hast exalted above everything. Yet in this question lies hid the great secret of this world. Choosing bread, thou wouldst have satisfied the universal and everlasting craving of humanity to find someone to worship. He says this is what we all long for. So long as man remains free, he strives for nothing so incessantly and so painfully as to find someone to worship. But man seeks to worship what is established beyond dispute, so that all men could agree at once to worship it. For these pitiful creatures are concerned not only to find what one or the other can worship, but to find something that all would believe in and worship. What is essential is that all may be together in it. And then he uses it. This craving for community of worship is the chief misery of every man individually and of all humanity from the beginning of time. And of course the word community is where we get our word communal, and of course Marx gets his word communism, right? In other words, this is what we all long for. More than anything, we long for all of us to be in somehow community. For the sake of common worship, they've slain each other with the sword. They've set up, notice it's they, it's not we here, right? They've set up gods and challenged one another. Put away your gods and come and worship ours, or we will kill you and your gods. And so it'll be to the end of the world, even when gods disappear from the earth. And we think about Nietzsche's God is Dead passage, which has to be read